please, it's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. He's always very modest about himself. Jarvis was an outstanding debater in the United States and an outstanding debate educator. But he felt that the world was a lot bigger than just the United States, and he was curious and wanted to find out about it. He has gone to Korea, and I would just say that since he has been in Korea 5 years, he has literally revolutionized debate in Korea. Why? Because he loves it, because he cares about it, and because he values each and every debater. Please welcome one of the world's great debate educators, Jason Jarvis.
All right, so what I want to talk about is government strategy. And the primary job, or the biggest advantage that the government has in the debate, is that they have the power to define the motion. Right? While we do have the motion, ultimately, I do not believe the focus of debates is the motion. Right? In actuality, the focus is the interpretation and the definition that is provided by the government. If the opposition comes in only prepared to debate the motion, and they're not ready to debate what the government says about the motion, then in almost every case, the opposition loses. Because ultimately, the debate centers around the way the government chooses to defend the motion. And that means that the government advantage centers totally around what they choose to do during the preparation time. The choices that you make before the debate starts often determine whether you win or lose when the debate happens. Right? That's your big advantage in the government. You make good choices, you often win. You make bad choices, the opposition defeats you rather easily and you lose. All right? So I want to talk about the way the government should make those choices, how to make those choices, and then we're going to practice this. So I've probably got about 20 to 30 minutes of lecture, and then I'm going to break you up into groups, and we're going to practice creating some definitions and motions on some definitions from some sample motions. All right? So this will be a bit more interactive, and in about 20 minutes I'm going to ask you to divide up into groups. All right? So I want to start by talking about the types of things that you want to do when you get your topic. Once you know that you've been assigned to the government side, in Asian-style parliamentary debate, you have to choose one of the three topics. You'll get three topics. You got to make some choices. Now, oftentimes, that choice process to begin with can determine how things go. When you're faced with topics, I see people making bad choices all the time. You get three topics, and you think, well, I don't know anything about the first topic. Let's talk about the topic I know. And you vote for the one that you know. But that may or may not be the one that's strategic for your side. So I want to caution you as you're making these choices from the beginning about which topic to debate. You ought to think about not just which topic you know a lot about, but is this topic strategic for me as a government team? And one of the things you want to consider about whether it's strategic or not is whether the topic has a large number of interpretations. Okay? Topics have a nature of either being open or closed. An open motion is a motion with words that have many possible interpretations. Closed motions are motions which don't give you many different ways to define the topic. Now, if you're an opposition team, you like closed motions because that limits the range of choices the government can make. If you're a government team, it's usually better to try and go for an open motion because that gives you more wiggle room. It makes you less predictable for the opposition. Right? And so from the get-go, that's what I want to talk about. And particularly we're talking about how to define motions. We want to look for ways to take motions and make them as unpredictable for the opposition as possible so you can gain a big advantage over them when you start the debate. So, what should you do once you get your topic? Well, once you've decided out of which of the three you're going to debate, first thing you need to do is to identify the key terms in the topic. Not all terms are important. Some of them are more important than others. And the ones you want to identify are the words that have the most possible interpretations, because that will allow you to make more choices. So, for example, let's say our motion is this house would get something to eat. So all of you are thinking about lunch right now. This house would get something to eat. Which words would be words that you might want to think about in terms of being key terms? Something. So what could that be? Somebody said food. That's true. What types of food?
Fresh.
Fresh food. Be more specific.
Genetically modified food.
Okay, one vote for this house would buy genetically modified food. All right. Or speak louder. A room full of debaters who are all kind of muttering. Potatoes. You're gonna have a boring dinner, but perhaps we'll be healthy. Spicy food. Somebody said hamburgers.
Inexpensive.
Cheap. All right? Or you might just start listing types. Like maybe we'll have biryani, or we'll go and we'll have hamburgers, or we would go and eat barbecue, or we would eat Chinese food, or we would eat some other type, Thai food. Okay? Then you gotta make some choice. Now, the other phrase that's always important in a debate is what? Is house. Who or where. Alright? And so I'm going to go talk about this in a minute, but you want to go through, identify those terms, and the second thing is list possible interpretations. Alright, you don't want to make a choice from the beginning, you want to make a list. Well, here's the different things that the house could be. It might be me and tuna. Right? Or maybe it's going to be all the people in this room. Or maybe only people from North-South University. Okay, you have to make some choices. So you make a list of interpretations there. Then you need to make a list of what it means, what is something to eat. And then you should compare those two lists and make a choice about which words you're going to defend and how. All right? So, step 3, choose your interpretation, and then you start preparing your model. All right? Identify the key terms, list possible interpretations, then make some choices about what your interpretation will be. Now, as the Prime Minister's got 3 basic jobs. To define the motion, to provide the model or the stance, and then to identify the split between himself or herself and the Deputy Prime Minister, and then identify their advantages and explain some arguments in favor of your position. All right, so that's the things the Prime Minister has to do. Which means collectively you're going to be basically helping the Prime Minister prepare their speech. Prime Minister's speech ought to be the best speech in the debate for that very reason. Because pretty much all you're doing in the first speech, the first prep time as the government is preparing that speech. So it ought to be very thorough, very detailed, and exceptionally clear. This is the thing I want to emphasize to you all, is that in many debates, if the debate is messy, and we can trace that chaos and confusion back to the Prime Minister, the government will get punished for that. If the debate is chaotic, and it's because the definition is vague, or the model is not specific, over and over again you will see governments losing debates or getting exceptionally low speaker points because they've caused that confusion. So it's very important that as you're going through this process, you are very thorough in it, and I talk in a few minutes about how to craft a policy that you're concluding all these components that you ought to include. Because if you don't, you're the ones that are likely to get punished for those choices. Tuna, you coming? Okay, fair enough. Questions about this before I start talking about the different ways to prepare your model? Straightforward? Okay, cool. Because I'm about to give you this, and then I'm going to test you by putting you in groups.
So by the split, you mean you both say, these are the reasons I'm going to give, and then my partner will offer another one.
Yes.
You can also think of this as a preview. You need to preview what your partner is going to say. And I think that indicates that you're prepared, it indicates cooperation, it indicates a unified stance on the part of your team.
Yes.
So you want to do that. And also, sometimes people don't preview because they really don't know what else they're going to say. Right? So you're showing that that's not true.
Yes.
We're prepared. We
So
preview.
when we say the split, Basically, every government team ought to have at least 3 to 4 major complete arguments. Remember, assertion, reasoning, evidence being a complete argument like Dr. Snyder just discussed. You ought to have 3 to 4 complete arguments for your side. Usually, half of those arguments should be in the Prime Minister's speech, and then the deputy leader is required to have at least 1 new argument, perhaps 2, depending on the development of these ideas. Now, I have heard that a lot of times in South Asian debating, for example, someone said to me, well, we always have like 12 advantages. Okay, to which I would say, you need to think about choices between depth over breadth. My advice to you would be that if you have 12 advantages, or reasons why you're doing it, your position is a good idea, that you will probably not spend much time creating details about those advantages. And I would argue that it's often better to have a smaller number of arguments which are very well developed than a large number of arguments which have very shallow development. Because then we can't really analyze those ideas in depth, and they will probably be less persuasive than they could be. So make some choices about which arguments are most important and focus on those.
And a lot of times you think they're separate arguments, but you're not.
Yes.
Saves money, more efficient, better use of resources. Those are all the same argument, right? Makes people happy. They'll vote for the people who propose it, right? That's the same argument. People like it. So don't, look and see how you can combine arguments.
Normally when you are government and you have a motion, you can defend that motion from 1 or 2 perspectives. The first way to defend the motion is to defend the motion as a policy, i.e. we identify a course of action that we think will solve this problem or create a solution to the issue raised by the motion. The second model that is usually presented would be what we would call a principle defense of the motion, which would be a moral or philosophical defense. You wouldn't present a policy, you would instead argue about the values behind the stance you are taking. All right, so I want to talk for a few minutes about these 2 different ways to provide a model. And then after that, I'm going to give you a sample topic, and we're going to try and prepare some motions and go through and discuss the different ideas you have. So, first way to do things would be to provide a policy, and I will say that this is the most typical form that governments tend to take. I would say 60%, probably 60% or more of the debates will often be about policies. Because we see problem, solution, let's look at these solutions. Now, what I often see though is models that I would say are incomplete. Incomplete. And if you are a strategic government team and you present a complete model, you can often defend yourself against most of the predicted attacks of the opposition by simply providing a complete format for your model. Now, there are 3 simple questions that are always asked about policies. If you do not answer these questions in the Prime Minister's speech, you should assume the opposition will raise these as objections against your proposal. Right? First question they always want to know, who's doing the policy? Who is the agent of action? Now, a policy is always considered to be a course of action for an organization or an institution. It could be a government, sometimes corporations have policies, NGOs and non-governmental organizations often have policies that guide their action as well. So if you're talking about a policy, that means somebody's taking that action. Who is that somebody? Are you talking about the United Nations? The government of Bangladesh? Are you talking about all Western governments? Because sometimes you can classify a group, like you might say democracies, or you might say countries in Asia. But you need to be specific about who it is you're talking about. And if you're vague, that's going to raise problems later on. If you're just like, well, we think this policy should be done. And you never say who. Does that mean every country on the planet? If so, you're raising a lot of potential objections for the opposition who can say, well, all governments don't act the same. They don't have the same budgets. They don't work the same. They represent different cultures. Laundry list of problems. Be specific. Who's taking the action? Second question, what are they doing? What is the policy? And you need to be specific. Exactly who's doing it and what it is you expect them to do. Third question, and this is one that tends to be a problem. How will your policy be done? And by that I don't mean what are you doing, I mean how will that policy be put into action? If you say the United Nations should go into Iraq and take over peacekeeping operations, then the next logical question is how will they do that? Which countries would contribute troops to United Nations force? Who's going to pay for that action? And
How many of them will there be?
How many will there be? And these often enforcement and feasibility issues over and over again cause problems for government teams. I would say this is an area that is often left out. People say, we got this idea, here's what we're going to do. And they go into why it's a good idea. And the opposition stands up and says, well, nobody wants to contribute troops to the United Nations, and the country that usually contributes troops is the U.S., and they've already got a lot of troops there. So who's going to send troops to Iraq to the United Nations? And then you're like, Russia? Iran? Well, wait, they've already got troops there. Okay, and so you have to answer these questions. And the thing is, when you're making the choice about your model, if you can't answer this question, make a different model. Okay? Because if you can't answer this, I guarantee you the opposition is going to stand up and say, you've got no money, you've got no ability, if people break, and here's a basic question, what if you pass a law, but people break the law? Will you put those people in jail? Will you fine them? You know, if you say that our agent of action will be the Bangladeshi government, all right, you've got this big policy. Well, do they have the means to enforce that policy? If it requires police resources, do they have them? If it requires a bunch of money, is that money available? All right, and so you need to be able to answer these basic enforcement questions because they are a failing point for governments over and over again.
I think one important thing is you need to be able to tell which motions are policy motions and which motions are principle motions. Okay? If the motion calls for a course of action, we should do something. It's a policy motion. A lot of times if it has the word should or would, right? Do is another do, implement, grant, create, establish, right? Active verbs, that's a sign of a policy motion. And you know, we saw a debate yesterday where they tried to make a principle motion out of a clearly policy case in a practice debate with judge. Day before yesterday.
All right, so after the government has done this, this is when people say, what is your model? Right, what is your model? Well, this is when they're talking about that. That means what are you doing, how are you doing it, who's doing it? All right, so if you have an incomplete model, guaranteed that you can probably get punished for that unless the opposition team is not that good. And you don't want to make your arguments assuming that the opposition team is really bad. Because if they turn out to be smarter than you thought, you may lose a debate. Okay. So go through this. It's also a good idea sometimes to include provisions in your model against the major arguments you think they're going to make. Right? If you can anticipate the objections to your proposal and include solutions to those objections in the course of developing your model, all right? You say what we're going to do, if that can include solutions to the major problems that you think they will identify, you can even be more strategic. All right? So you want to do this with an idea of the types of arguments you think they're going to make against you. All right? Spend a little bit of time thinking about that and adjust your model to account for the types of objections they're likely to raise. Strategic governments always do that as well.
Yeah, and if it's something like people won't know how to do it, educate them.
Right.
If it's like farmers will be hurt by cutting subsidies, give them money. Right?
Right.
Do whatever solves the problem.
If they say you're not giving enough money, you can always say, well, we'll pay for this by a cigarette tax, or we'll have some other way, whatever. You need to think about those objections and try and incorporate them as solutions into the course of developing the model. All right, second way to do this, a philosophical defense. Now, I will caution you by saying that oftentimes I think this is often used as kind of a cop-out strategy. Okay, I think a lot of times when people can't think of a policy, they stand up and they say, well, we're going to defend the motion in principle. They don't really know what to do. Right, because we don't really have any other ideas, so principle. And they don't really know what that means, okay? But sometimes there are motions which are better defended by principles than by policies, okay? And those are motions, as Tuna just said, sometimes topics ask more of a value judgment. Right? If the motion was like, this house would condemn abortion, Okay, well, you could have a policy that would say abortion should be illegal, or we could have a debate about all of the moral reasons why abortion is bad. And that would be a principled defense of the motion. You identify values, morals, or philosophical issues and defend those as the reasons why we should not take the stance of what the motion says. All right? But in this case, the key thing is identifying what I would call core values. And those might be religious, they might be moral, they might be philosophical. If you don't know what those are, get out philosophy textbooks. Right? We're at debates, I would argue, in fact, most debate comes from sort of a moral center. Like, I think if we sit down and talk about this, almost all policies are things that are based upon certain values that we have about right and wrong. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that most controversies, at their very core, are disputes between people about what they think is right or wrong. You have a particular worldview based on your religion or your culture about how something should be done. And that worldview then manifests itself in particular policy solutions to different problems. So in many cases, principles are the foundations upon which controversies are created. And so by taking particular stands, you can either advocate or reject particular policies. So for example, if you looked at the war in Iraq, in the lead, how many people supported the war in Iraq? Not me either. Okay, fair enough.
You look like the American elector.
Okay, right, at least today. But in the run-up to the Iraq War, if you surveyed people who supported the war, or even listened to people who argued in favor of it, most of those justifications were utilitarian in nature. What does this mean? What is utilitarianism?
Most benefit for the most people.
Okay, yes, what Dr. Sider said. Now, basically, those justifications were things like, well, Saddam has lots of weapons of mass destruction. We've got to protect people from the danger he poses. And so, by taking this action, even if it causes some disruption in the region, the greater good will be served by this behavior. Right? So utilitarianism often says, basically, that we don't care if there's some short-term problems because the long-term goal is so good that the action is justified. Okay? And so if we're saving, so for example, if Dr. Snyder had a disease, all right, let's say it's a terrible disease, which obviously means sweating, right? And that disease threatened the life of all of these people, would we kill Dr. Snyder to save everyone here? Right? Or would you say let him live and then we all risk dying as well? Well, from a utilitarian perspective, we say kill Dr. Snyder because that protects all these other people. Now, the obvious problem is maybe he's innocent. Maybe sweating is just natural in a hot environment. All right? But if the end is a good one, utilitarian philosophy would say, okay, well, that means it's justified. Now, as a government team, you might use utilitarianism as a principled defense of emotion. Or you might use it as an opposition. The opposition could also use it to criticize a particular government strategy. But the idea being you identify some core values, you explain why they're good, you give practical examples of how that philosophy can benefit society, and then you defend the motion in that way. Okay? But you shouldn't use it as a cop-out just because you can't think of a policy. Because that's not going to really get you anywhere. Questions about either of these approaches? Okay, good.
Yeah, usually in the principal approach, there's a value term in the motion. Something like beauty, democracy, freedom, some value term. And then it connects it to something else, right? Like capital punishment is morally unacceptable, right? That would be clearly a principal motion, right? And so, although a motion that said in some cases capital punishment would be justified, that's probably not a principal motion because it says should be, right? So it looks like a policy. Yes?
Question?
If the implementation of the policy actually requires the change of an existing policy, can that be the opposition's case?
Well, I think usually the implementation of policy does require the change in existing policy. So I don't.
Well,
I guess
are you saying that should the opposition say the old policy is better?
Suppose because right now United Nations just spends peace troops, right? So in that case, should the UN change the policy and should the opposition's case should be that requirement should be met first and then we can talk about this?
Well, I mean, I think that's, if you're just saying they can't do it, that's one thing. But if you're saying they can't do it because they don't have the resources, that's one argument. If you're saying we can't do it because that's not what we're doing now, I don't think that's a very smart argument, because of course that's not what we're doing now, otherwise there would not be a controversy. Do you know what I mean? Like, the reason we have a problem in the status quo is usually because somebody's screwing up, and the government has to advocate a solution to that mistake. So I don't think it's fair to say, well, we're not fixing that now, so you should lose. No, I mean, that's pretty much why we're having the debate. But at the same time, you're saying there's a structural barrier that can't be fixed. That's a bit different.
Yeah, then your model would say the UN should recruit and train additional troops specifically for service in Iraq from one of the following 8 countries. Then you solve that problem.
Yes, sir.
If you have open-ended motions, is it better to define and then work out a policy, or have a policy and then build it into the definition?
Well, if you've already got a policy, then you're just trying to redefine the motion. I think it's always good to make the list first, because it will give you an idea perhaps of policies you might not have considered. At least 5 minutes listing terms, and even if at the end of it you conclude to go with the original idea you had, that's okay. But you want to at least give yourself a chance to think of other options that might be better. But clearly, if you've got a big matter file and you're ready to go, then take your big matter file and roll with it if that's what you want to do. Yes, sir.
First, a great thank you to the one speech you have delivered. And particularly, I got 2 questions for you.
Okay.
Firstly, is that whether it is smart to define motion with that, to shift the motion from value to policy, for example, just we should condemn abortion, and then mean that we should abolish the usage of the condom in the universities, and then whether it is smart to do this in shifting the motion.
Well, I think you have to shift the motion only to the extent that it allows you to get a strategic advantage, but not shift it to the point that you're not debating the topic. Okay, so I mean, you gotta, because you still have to be within the parameters of the topic.
Yeah, I would just say, if you interpret the motion in such a way that it looks like you're avoiding dealing with the major issues, you will be punished.
Yeah, that can hurt.
Right? The judges expect you to debate the major issues in this area of controversy. So if you all of a sudden say, well, prostitution should be legalized in Iceland because they have different moral codes, etc., then that's narrowing the motion too much, and you'll be punished. The word for this is, I hate to teach this, is you're squirreling the motion, right? You're abusing the motion, and don't do that. For a job of the government is not to avoid debate, but to set up a good debate.
Yeah. You want to create a strategic debate. Second question.
Second question, that's, I clearly remember that last year I have seen debating between motions that whether this has believed that environmental protection is more important than non-government. And the government side believe that the previous one is more important, but the opposition side rebuttal in this way that both sides are important. And the final result is that the opposition side win the debate. And I'm wondering that whether it is okay to rebut in this way that both sides are important.
Sure, and obviously if the government can't defend their position, then they're going to lose the debate. And it says that's what the motion's calling for, that means their burden is to prove it is more important. That's calling for a comparison, and they should have to win. If they can't defend their comparison, I would think that means they can't win.
Well, and this often happens in value motions. You have in a principled situation, you have 2 in conflict. Freedom of the press is more important than right to privacy. Right? Here's 2 abstract things. Now, to address your question, you could show, the opposition could show freedom of the press is not important, right to privacy is really important. But it would seem to me not strategically wise for you to say, no, they're of equal importance. Because then it's really easy for the other side to show, well, ours is a little tiny bit better. I don't think it's good to say they're of equal importance. I don't think it's strategically wise.
I think it's a hard position to win, but if you're going to try and win, then whatever.
I wonder that when I can ask another question for you.
Yeah, although I would like to kind of move on to some practical examples, and then maybe we can, if you've still got questions after we've done the examples, then let's come back.
Thank you.
actually I'm still puzzled because maybe later, just now my classmate he asked the motion is which is more important, the development of the economy and the environmental protection, which is more important. And the government they think that the economic development is much more important.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you? I think this is a very specific case example and not necessarily relevant to what we're trying to do
Yeah,
here.
well,
So can we come back to this in a little while?
I can answer Billy. Whoever wrote a motion saying that, both these things are important is ridiculous. That's a terrible motion. The motion should ask for a choice. This is more important than this.
It did.
And so, if the motion you're talking about doesn't make any sense. But if it's saying X is more important than Y, then that's what the government should say, and the opposition should say, no, X is not very important, and Y is really important.
Anyway, let's talk about this after the lecture. I want to go through, because I have some very specific things I want us to try and focus on right now. Are there any questions about policy versus principle? Because I think that's a more technical question about what happened in a specific debate.
Can we approach the motion in the policy method and principle method as well? For example, you say.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Can we approach the motion with
Can you take that
policy
microphone
method?
away? Just talk to me.
Can we approach the policy, the motion with the policy method as well as the principle method? For example, you say that this
Okay.
house condemns abortion.
Gotcha. The short answer to your question is, if it's a policy, one of your advantages could be, and I would even argue should be, a principle. Okay, because from principles we create policies. All right. Now, you cannot go the other way. All right. If you're offering a principle defense, it is not appropriate in the middle of your case to suddenly say, well, here's a policy. Because now you're shifting back into a different mode of discussion. Does that make sense? All right? So we don't create policies and then learn principles from them. This creates the other, if that makes any sense. So, and I think I would even go so far as to say, if you have a policy, it's smart to have a principle defense, because then maybe it doesn't matter if your policy works completely well, because the morality is good enough to justify it. Right? So let's say you lose some of the feasibility and mechanism arguments, but then you can say, hey, it doesn't matter if we work perfectly, because morally we're a good idea. So I think that's actually quite strategic to include a principle in defense of your policy. That's a very good question. Other questions? All right, divide up into groups. Everybody needs to have a group of at least 5 people. All right, so if you don't know your neighbors, now is a good time to meet them. All right, so everybody, please
Go, don't
divide
waste
up.
time.
Yes, divide up
Make
into groups.
Go, go, go.
Divide into groups.
Move your chairs and sit in a circle. Make a circle. Do it.
Join one?